I do have the pleasure of bringing the word today. Thanks. Hey. Oh, no, that's too much. Okay. I have a question, a little trivia for you today. Where were you on April 19th, so this day, but 2005, 20 years ago? Take a moment, think about where did you live? Who was with you during that season as key people in your life? What was the Lord doing in your life at that time? Can everyone remember that? If you're too young to remember 2005, or if drug use led to some brain cells not firing, consider where you were in 2015 or even 2020. Just 5 years ago, in 2020, we were facing some pretty drastic global changes. Do you remember that? To get even more dramatic, if you are able, let's go back 20 years. To refresh your memory, George W. Bush was president, YouTube, this new thing, was launched, and Hurricane Katrina would devastate the South later that year. That was really intense for a second. At that point in my life, 20 years ago, I was coming to the end of a season. I was preparing to graduate college in New York with a degree in airport management, and I was married at that time for a year and a half. After coming to faith in 2003, my interests had changed so dramatically that I had left my first airport job only to find out how difficult it would be to find another job. I finally found an opportunity at a job fair at the college. And although I had landed at an aviation company that was just minutes from my house, I was struggling with the realization that this did not feel like my future. At this point, as I said, Val and I had been married for a year and a half, and we had plenty of opportunities to do ministry together. We were leading worship at a local church and traveling to do ministry with Val's parents on the weekends. Another church invited us to become their youth leaders and offered us a house to live in. However, as a young believer, I recognized my own need for further training. At the time, Val was coming to grips with the fact that my passion had shifted from aviation to ministry, and I was coming to grips with the fact that I needed some kind of training and that it would not be found in New York, and rather, I would have to look elsewhere. So, somewhere around April 19th of 2005, we were learning about schools in Springfield, Missouri, of all places, where I could go to seminary and Val could finish her biology degree. And although it seemed crazy for New Yorkers to relocate to southern Missouri, Val and I were ready for a change. Visiting Missouri caused us to realize that we could actually afford a place there. The prices were a little different, while going to school and even just working part-time. Our families were supportive, though they were sad to see us go, and we were sad to leave. My aviation company even supported us and contributed to our scouting trip, which was kind of amazing because I had been there for a very short season. That season, after we moved to Missouri, would last approximately 4 years, and it would bring about great change in our lives. Val and I would finish our degrees. It is there in Springfield, Missouri, of all places, that we became involved with Messianic Judaism through the influence of Dr. Ray Gannon. We had 2 children there. Val's parents would also move from New York and join us in Missouri. I served with a few ministries during those years. However, the primary jobs that Val and I found during that season were at a Korean Presbyterian church. And although at the time we were neither Korean nor Presbyterian, the church had recently undergone a split, and they were looking to rebuild. So they posted the need for a youth minister and a children's minister on the community board in our seminary's student lounge. Eager to have more multicultural experiences, Val and I applied and were accepted. The 4 years of serving a Korean congregation bore wonderful memories for us. One of the highlights was the community holding a celebration when Annabelle turned 100 days old, according to their custom. They made us feel so welcomed. They taught us a great deal about honor and respect. We took Korean lessons, Val and I. I personally did not get very far. I got caught on this letter of the alphabet that was between a G and a K sound. And I'd say, ga? No, ga. No, ga? No, ga. And it would go on like this for a while. I couldn't get past this point. The locals in Springfield, Missouri, would refer to Springfield as a trap. Many people would come to school and end up staying, and it wasn't a bad little town. However, the cheap prices there made it almost impossible to move anywhere else without a significant downgrade. So typically, seminary graduates would find local teaching jobs, and biology graduates might find local medical jobs. However, Val and I graduated in 2009 during a time known as the Great Recession, and jobs were nowhere to be found. It was also clear to us that our time at the Korean church was coming to an end. After serving for 4 years, we were seeing the church grow and get healthy again. Though their identity as a Korean congregation was not in question, Val and I had little knowledge of the Presbyterian traditions. They had never expected us to be Presbyterians. However, an associate pastor had recently been brought in from South Korea. And in my first meeting with him, he asked me to what extent I was teaching the youth the Westminster Catechism. At this point, it was abundantly clear to me that our season at the Korean church was coming to a close. The beautiful thing about the Ruach, the Spirit, is that the Ruach was moving in them and moving in us at the same time with the same message. At the same time that they were deepening their roots as Presbyterians, we were feeling a breeze pushing us towards planting a Messianic community in Southern California. Additionally, as we were preparing to graduate with our degrees, our purpose for moving to Missouri had been accomplished, and it was clear to us that it was our time to move into the next season somewhere else. The title of my message is "The Ruach is the Reason for the Season." It comes from Acts chapter 15, verses 30 through 35, and I will be asking you 3 questions based upon this passage. First, who is with you? Second, what is the Ruach doing where you are? And lastly, what season are you in? Ultimately, I would like you to leave here today perceiving the conditions around you. My outline can be found on the YouVersion app, and I will be reading from the Tree of Life version. Acts 15, verse 30 reads as follows. So, when they were sent off, they went down to Antioch, and when they had gathered the whole group together, they delivered the letter. Who is with you? In this verse, the sent ones were Barnabas, Paul, Judah, and Silas. They were being sent north about 300 miles to Antioch, which is a much harder journey to make without the conveniences of automobiles and air travel that we have. This would likely take them from 3 weeks to a month, with the possibility of traveling by walking, by mule, or by chariot. And I'm sure that these brothers would have become very familiar with one another over the course of their traveling together. They were not merely traveling for pleasure. They weren't taking a gap year either. Rather, they had a job to do. The Jerusalem Council had reached a decision, and these men were tasked with delivering the letter to Antioch. However, they were not merely mailmen. They would read, they would explain, and they would even embody the views represented in the letter. To be clear, as Rabbi Ari has noted, we see a shift in these verses. If you will note in verse 25 of Acts 15, we see Barnabas and Paul. Yet, by verse 35, we read Paul and Barnabas. I believe that Luke is intentionally noting a shift in the influence of Paul within the community of faith. However, the Jerusalem community saw the delivery of this letter as a weighty task. They not only sent Barnabas and Paul, but they also sent Judah and Silas. This would give even more certainty to the Antioch community that the words of the letter were trustworthy. Practically speaking, it would also make for a safer journey with even more accountability. Furthermore, it seemed to deepen their bonds, as this tends to happen when we travel together. In fact, Paul and Silas would end up pairing up for a different journey in the season that follows in the next passage. Another benefit of these four men traveling together was that after their task was accomplished, Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch for a time, while Judah and Silas returned to Jerusalem. However, there is some tension within the text about this detail, which we will pick up on in a bit. This team-based ministry would allow some to rest while others stepped in. For instance, it is Judah and Silas who minister at length when they arrive in Antioch, not Paul and Barnabas. Judah and Silas seem to have a tag team type of dynamic in their ministry. Perhaps it is something like what we recently experienced when Rabbi Marty and Rabbi Ari came up to minister together. Although it is not typical to hear of a long message giving strength to the community, something about the dynamic between Judah and Silas was encouraging, even in the midst of a lengthy message. There was a prophetic quality to their ministry. I must admit, when I see Rabbi Marty and Rabbi Ari taking the stage together, I know that it will be a lengthy message. However, I have found these discussions to be life-giving, and the dynamic between the two of them makes it even better. Later on, when Judah and Silas returned to give report to the Jerusalem community, Paul and Barnabas had the freedom to remain in Antioch. Such is the blessing of ministering with others. Yet, as Rabbi Ari will cover in our next passage, ministering together can also lead to conflict between individuals. As I once heard Rabbi Marty say, the best thing about ministry is the people, and the worst thing about ministry is the people. Yet we see the Ruach ministering through groups rather than individuals. Even with the conflict that arises between people, one can discern how the Ruach can lead different people in different directions. Perhaps it is the Ruach that reveals who we are to walk with for a given season of life. And I say season because everything has its time. Even the most successful and long-term relationships have a time limit in our present reality. We may be in a season for 40 days or 40 years, and we may not know the difference until the time has passed. There is a saying that if you want something done right, do it yourself. And while this might work with getting your dishes clean, or it might not, the way of the kingdom involves working with others, mutual submission, and order. Yeshua built teams around him to continue the work. Paul, with all his dynamism, understood the need of others in order to make a kingdom impact. And here we see these 4 men submitted to the Jerusalem council. We see them making room for one another as they minister. And as it was true in the book of Acts, it is true for us today. God desires order within his community. These men did not merely go to Antioch on their own authority. These 4 men traveled as delegates of the Jerusalem council. They went under the authority that Yeshua had established during his earthly ministry. As the elder Dave used to say, we only have as much authority as we are willing to submit ourselves to. Though these 4 men each carried their own dynamism, they made room for one another and were submitted to the authority of the council and the Lord himself. So I ask you today, who is with you? If the Lord is using you to accomplish his purposes here on the earth, it is highly likely that he is not only calling you to lead, but also to follow. When I think back 20 years, I think about people that were influencing my life, as well as people whose lives I was influencing. At that time, I was making an impact in campus ministry, but that only happened because of those that trusted me with that position of leadership, counseled me, and encouraged me in order to succeed. Can you think of 3 people that you are submitted to at this season of your life? Perhaps they speak into different areas. Can you think of 3 people whose lives you are impacting for the kingdom? We can learn a great deal about the Lord's seasons by considering who is pouring into us and whose lives we are pouring into in return. Acts 15, verses 31 through 32 read as follows. The people read it and rejoiced over its encouragement. Judah and Silas, prophets themselves, encouraged the brothers and sisters with a long message and strengthened them. Chazak. What is the Ruach doing where you are? Did anyone check the weather this morning? It is wise to be aware of our surroundings so that we can dress and act accordingly. In a similar sense, it is good for us to know not only what season of life we are in, but what the Ruach is doing at this particular time and place. Following seminary, our family spent a 5-year season in Southern California. And even though we didn't accomplish all of our goals there, we accomplished other things that we didn't expect. Namely, I believe that God used that 5-year season to prepare us for coming here. I'm not sure how Paul felt when he experienced shipwrecks or being beaten as a grown man, but Yeshua used all of these things in Paul's life for his glory. I remember when our time was coming to an end in California. And it was as if we had done everything that we could there. And although I had gone there with a long-term mentality, which I think is helpful for enduring hardship, our entire family was sensing that the season was coming to an end. The good news is that even if a season is coming to an end, it is not the end of God's work. When I realized the season was coming to a close, my eyes lifted to the horizon. If God was done working with us in that place, we wanted to know, where was he leading us next? It was the beginning of a new possibility. In March of 2014, I received a call from Rabbi Marty and Rabbi Ari. This is before it became Rabbi Ari and Rabbi Marty. In any case, it shocked me that I was needed here. And although I was submitted to leaders, as well as a denomination in Southern California, in many ways, it felt as if I was alone, building a ship in the middle of the desert that was not going anywhere. I say this fully realizing that I had wonderful friends and mentors around me during that season. I even had the privilege of many personal interactions with Jack Hayford at the King's University during that season. And yet, even with the best spiritual nurture, our efforts were not coming to fruition. It was hard to see it at the time, but short-term failure did not equate with long-term failure. I was talking with Cheryl this week, our beloved frontline office worker, and asking her what she was doing 20 years ago. She shared with me, and didn't mind me sharing with you, that at the time she was a kindergarten teacher. Can you imagine that? But she ran into a conflict in her work with the way that she was teaching as a bilingual teacher. And there was a conflict with an administrator. So she went through this season of being shaken up and not knowing if she can continue in her work. And it was during this time that Rabbi Marty challenged her to consider coming here to Baruch HaShem. This is 20 years ago when she began. And she took the challenge. And what was funny about the story is just after she began to serve here at Baruch HaShem, the conflict that she was having at the school resolved itself. But it was there just long enough to kind of push her out and end the season for her. And I'm sure she was a wonderful kindergarten teacher. But I don't know about you, I'm grateful that Cheryl Selk has been here for the past 20 years serving. What a wonderful gift. When we visited BHS in 2014, we realized that though we had been called to build a ship in the desert for 5 years, we now had the privilege of getting onto a ship that had already been built. It was already moving. We simply had to get on board. It felt like a tremendous privilege, after struggling for years, to reap the benefit of the hard work of others. The Lord shifted the question in my heart from, what can I do for the Lord, to, what is the Lord already doing, and how can I be a part of it? Here in the text, though it seems like we are witnessing the ministry of Paul and Barnabas and Judas and Silas, they are not the ones who made this happen. They merely became participants in what the Lord was already doing in that time and place. The Ruach had been moving in Antioch, and word had spread to Jerusalem. The Ruach moved in Jerusalem, and now the same wind was blowing through Antioch. As you know, the word Ruach can be translated as wind, breath, spirit, or energy. Understanding what the Ruach is doing is much like being aware of the weather around us. It is not the same every day and every season. Rather, we must discern what the Ruach is doing. It is a living and dynamic entity. We cannot always predict the way that it moves, how strongly, or for what duration of time. We are fortunate to have such technology for tracking the weather. There have even been nights where I've told Val, let's take a walk because the rain will begin in about an hour. And sure enough, the forecast is fairly accurate, and we can plan our lives accordingly. However, the times and seasons of the Ruach do not come from a Google forecast. There was a great amount of prayer, debate, waiting on the Lord, and submitting to authority that went into this spiritual forecast that was being delivered to Antioch on the account of the Jerusalem Council. The Ruach moved in such a way that these diverse communities, though geographically separated, were spiritually united. The tendency of human interaction, I don't know about in your life, but in mine perhaps, is for things to fall apart. There's a great book, by the way, called Things Fall Apart, if you haven't read it. We must take notice when the Spirit moves in such a way to bring about such unity and understanding between people. The move of the Ruach brought new understanding in Jerusalem and Antioch. We not only see the alignment of communities, but we also see the gifts of individuals, such as Judah and Silas, being used for the edification of the community. It is important for us to realize, even if we are fortunate enough to be part of something that the Ruach is doing, that the Ruach is not only at work here among us. Rather, the Ruach is moving in various places at the same time. We do not own the Ruach. It moves where it wills. It is amazing to note, however, how the Ruach is moving among us and how it is moving among the world. We are privileged to have the freedom to travel to other countries and witness what God is doing. We are able to cover distances that the early followers of Yeshua couldn't have imagined. It is also important to realize that God is ministering uniquely through different people. We tend to be locked into our own perspectives, but the Lord has many tools in the toolbox. We may be good for one purpose, while He will use others for different tasks. Rather than envy the gifts of others, we should rejoice in the way that the Lord has so many options to communicate with the world, and yet He still chooses us. It is a tremendous gift to know God and have the sense of being created for His purposes. So I ask you, what is the Lord doing where you are? What are the spiritual conditions? Are you in a season of celebration? Are you in a season of mourning? Are you in a season of pouring out? Are you in a season of being equipped? What is the Lord presently doing in you and throughout our community? Of course, I can't talk about seasons without mentioning the season we presently find ourselves in, namely Pesach, or Passover. And Pesach is a paradox, as it is a time that we not only reflect on our bondage to, but also our deliverance from Egypt. And personally, we may also reflect on our own sin and deliverance through our Messiah, Yeshua. Yeshua not only delivered us, but continues to deliver us. It is His name and character. As we get outside of ourselves and interact with others, we see the way that God is ministering, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of those around us. And we get a sense of how the breeze of the Ruach is moving in this season. Acts chapter 15, verses 33 through 35, read as follows. After spending some time there, they were sent off with shalom by the brothers and sisters who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, teaching and proclaiming the word of the Lord with many others. What season are you in? First, we have to address a discrepancy in the text. If you've noticed, when I was just reading, we go from verse 33 to verse 35. And your text like mine, may have a note concerning verse 34, which says something like it is found in some manuscripts, but not in most manuscripts. Why is this? Well, it seems probable that the verse was added later to address this conflict that is present in the text. And although we won't cover it today, in the next section, in verse 40, we see Paul selecting Silas as his travel companion and continuing on. So, the issue that perhaps is being addressed with this verse 34 becomes how Silas made it back to Jerusalem and then back to Antioch after a few days. Doesn't seem probable. Seems like that journey would take at least a couple of months if he didn't even spend any time in Jerusalem. So, perhaps the added verse is a way to explain a conflict in the narrative, because the timing doesn't seem to line up. And unfortunately, we don't have access to other contemporary documents that explain the details that we lack from this story. However, what does make it easy is that all manuscripts agree that Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch. I read that wrong. Oh, no, that's true. Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, and that after some time, Paul and Silas went forth together. So, from what we can understand in the text, after spending some time in Antioch and accomplishing the mission of their going there in the first place, some returned to Jerusalem, namely Judah and the nebulous case of Silas, and others remained, namely Paul and Barnabas, for a time. The principle that I draw from this concerns the unique way that the Ruach guides us as individuals within a community. This can be challenging for us emotionally. We may assume because we work together for a season, because we are brothers and sisters in the Lord, that it will always be this way. And again, we may be privileged to have 40-year relationships, even represented here in this room. Yet, we don't know when we are walking into a 40-day season or a 40-year season. And I think we can be surprised by both the longevity of some seasons and the brevity of others. There are things that we make decisions about, and so much more that is outside of our control. I think the best thing that we can do is to fully embrace the season in which we find ourselves. God will surely call us to seasons of lack and seasons of plenty. There may be seasons where we face financial pressure, and others where we face emotional turmoil or even spiritual attack. There is a time and a season for everything. The good news and the bad news is that the season will pass. Trials will not last forever, and neither will prosperity. Paul is a great example of a person who faced all kinds of circumstances, yet maintained his trust in Adonai. So how would you identify the season that you presently find yourself in? Could you identify this season with 3 adjectives or describing words? Last year, a massive tree came down in my front yard. It was a beautiful and mature tree. However, it was also the tree where Joe, my father-in-law, who passed in 2021, used to sit on a bench covered by its shade, watching his grandchildren play in the front of the house. Even our neighbors mentioned Joe as the one who used to sit underneath the tree on that bench in front of our house. It is the tree where Annabelle would take selfies in front of the changing colors every season. It is the tree David would climb as a young boy. It's connected to all kinds of family memories. And while it was sad to see it hauled away and to pay the bill, There is now a young tree growing in its place. We planted it in the fall, and we didn't know at the time whether it would even take. But in some way, it gives me hope to see that little tree bursting forth with life. Our days on earth are but a season. And even within this life, we have seasons or chapters where the Lord does unique things with us to the extent that we are willing to follow his guidance. In his wisdom, God gives each of us gifts and callings. There are things that we face for just a short season and other elements which end up defining our lives. I heard a lesson about calling from a surprising source recently. The comedian Jerry Seinfeld was discussing the commitment that he made to his craft at a young age. And although he became wealthy and successful, as a young comedian, he didn't receive the same respect and had not yet found material success. Yet he was committed to comedy regardless of the result. He described it as a hell that he can tolerate. In other words, we each have certain tasks which we have been designed for. And although they will not be easy to accomplish, we are willing to suffer for those things. This is a good indication of where God is calling each of us. If you feel called to a particular task or a particular location, you will be willing to endure hardship in it, as well as the blessings that come with it. Before I close today, I have some BHS trivia. Does anyone want to play BHS trivia? Do you know what happened at BHS on this very day in 1997? Does anyone know? Got one? There was a bar mitzvah here for a young man named Ari Waldman. Go figure. Were any of you here on that day? Hey, look at that. That's beautiful. Me, I was getting into trouble somewhere in New York at that time. And do you know, continuing in BHS trivia, what happened the very next week after Rabbi Ari's bar mitzvah here at Baruch HaShem? Yes, I see a few hands go up. It's hard to forget, I'm sure. We had an active shooter on our campus. Were any of you here for that? Yeah. It is a miracle that the shooter was not able to accomplish his goals here on that day. God has been faithful to us throughout the years. And though the wheat and the tares grow together, God is in control of the times and seasons of our communal and personal lives. In conclusion, I want to encourage you to perceive the Lord's activity by asking the following questions. First, who is with you during this season? Next, what is the Ruach doing where you are? And finally, what season do you find yourself in? May the Lord strengthen you to endure hardship and to receive his blessing. Shabbat Shalom.